Why Switzerland still protects the world's richest families. When people think about Switzerland, they usually picture snow-covered mountains, luxury watches, chocolate, and perhaps the famous image of secret bank vaults hidden beneath the Alps. For decades, Hollywood helped reinforce that image, portraying Switzerland as a mysterious country where dictators, billionaires, and royalty quietly stored their fortunes behind numbered bank accounts protected by absolute secrecy. But that version of Switzerland is no longer entirely true. Over the past 2 decades, international pressure, stricter financial regulations, and global agreements on tax transparency have fundamentally changed Swiss banking. Anonymous accounts have largely disappeared. Governments exchange financial information more freely than ever before, and the era of hiding vast fortunes behind absolute banking secrecy has, for the most part, come to an end. Yet something remarkable happened as those changes unfolded. Instead of watching wealthy clients leave, Switzerland remained one of the world's largest centers for private wealth management. Today, the country continues to oversee trillions of dollars in international assets, more cross-border private wealth than almost any other financial hub on Earth. The headquarters of some of the world's oldest private banks still sit in Geneva and Zurich. Billionaire families continue establishing family offices across the country, and some of the wealthiest dynasties on the planet still trust Swiss institutions to preserve fortunes that have existed for generations. If secrecy is no longer Switzerland's greatest advantage, then why do so many of the world's richest families continue choosing this small alpine nation over financial centers like New York, London, Singapore, or Dubai? The answer lies in a misunderstanding that has surrounded Switzerland for decades. Most people assume the country's success was built on helping wealthy people hide their money, but secrecy alone could never have sustained its reputation for more than 2 centuries. Instead, Switzerland built something far more valuable than confidential bank accounts. It built trust. Long before it became synonymous with private banking, Switzerland had already earned a reputation for political stability, legal certainty, financial discipline, and institutional continuity. While governments across Europe were collapsing, currencies were losing value, and wars repeatedly destroyed fortunes that had taken generations to build, Switzerland quietly developed into one of the few places where wealth could survive almost untouched. That reputation became its greatest asset, and unlike banking secrecy, it has never depended on changing laws or international politics. For families worth billions of dollars, protecting wealth is a completely different challenge from creating it. Building a fortune often requires risk, innovation, and the willingness to seize opportunities before anyone else. Preserving that fortune, however, demands patience, predictability, and institutions capable of surviving political upheaval, economic crises, and generational change. The world's oldest fortunes are not managed with the expectation of maximizing returns every year. They are managed with the objective of ensuring that children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren inherit stable wealth decades into the future. That requires far more than profitable investments. It requires confidence that the country protecting those assets will remain reliable regardless of who wins elections, how markets perform, or what conflicts emerge elsewhere in the world. This is precisely where Switzerland distinguished itself from almost every other nation. Over hundreds of years, it transformed characteristics that most countries take for granted: political neutrality, an independent judiciary, a stable currency, strong property rights, and a culture of discretion into one of the world's most successful financial ecosystems. The result was not simply a banking industry, but an entire infrastructure designed around preserving wealth across generations. That is why billionaire families continue placing their confidence in Switzerland even after the decline of traditional banking secrecy. They are not simply buying financial services. They are buying institutional stability that has been tested repeatedly throughout history. The story of Switzerland, therefore, is not really about hidden bank accounts or mysterious vaults. It is the story of how one small country, with few natural resources and no global empire, convinced the world's wealthiest families that it could protect their fortunes better than almost anyone else. It is a story about trust becoming an economic asset, stability becoming a national export, and why, in a world defined by constant uncertainty, Switzerland continues to occupy a unique place in the financial lives of the global elite. To understand why the richest families on Earth still choose Switzerland today, we first need to understand how a small mountain nation became the safest place in the world for wealth long before it ever became famous for banking. Chapter 1. How a small mountain nation became the world's safe haven. Long before Switzerland became synonymous with private banking, it had already achieved something that many of the world's most powerful nations never managed to accomplish. It created an environment of extraordinary political continuity in a continent defined by instability. Looking at modern Switzerland, it is easy to assume that its prosperity was inevitable, but history tells a very different story. This is a country with no access to the sea, no vast reserves of natural resources, no colonial empire, and a population smaller than many global cities. By conventional standards, Switzerland should never have become one of the world's most influential financial centers. Yet over the course of several centuries, it transformed these apparent disadvantages into strengths, gradually building a reputation that attracted merchants, industrialists, aristocrats, and eventually some of the wealthiest families on Earth. The origins of that transformation can be traced back to the country's geography. Switzerland sits at the heart of Europe, surrounded by powerful neighbors including France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. Throughout history, this location could have made it a constant battleground between competing empires. Instead, the towering Alps created one of Europe's most formidable natural barriers. While mountain passes remained important trade routes connecting northern and southern Europe, the rugged landscape made large-scale invasions both expensive and strategically difficult. Geography alone did not guarantee independence, but it gave the early Swiss Confederation a unique opportunity to defend itself against larger powers while developing a political identity based on local cooperation rather than imperial expansion. Unlike many European kingdoms that centralized authority under powerful monarchs, the Swiss Confederation evolved through alliances between relatively independent cantons. These communities recognized that their survival depended on cooperation rather than conquest, creating a decentralized political culture that valued compromise, local autonomy, and shared responsibility. Although disagreements between cantons were common, the system encouraged negotiation instead of prolonged internal conflict. Over time, this approach produced institutions that proved remarkably resilient. While other parts of Europe experienced repeated struggles over succession, religion, and territorial expansion, Switzerland gradually established a tradition of governance built on consensus rather than domination. The defining moment in Switzerland's political identity came in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Following Napoleon's defeat, European leaders gathered at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to redraw the continent's political map and restore stability after decades of conflict. During these negotiations, the great powers formally recognized Switzerland's permanent neutrality. On the surface, this decision served Europe's strategic interests by creating a neutral buffer between rival states, reducing the likelihood of future wars spreading through the Alpine region. For Switzerland, however, neutrality became much more than a diplomatic arrangement. It evolved into a guiding principle that shaped the country's domestic politics, foreign policy, and ultimately its economic future. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Europe endured extraordinary upheaval. The continent witnessed revolutions that overthrew monarchies, the unification of Germany and Italy, the collapse of centuries-old empires, two devastating world wars, and the ideological confrontation of the Cold War. Entire nations were occupied, borders were redrawn, currencies became worthless, and governments disappeared almost overnight. Wealth that had taken generations to accumulate was frequently destroyed by confiscation, inflation, military conflict, or political revolution. Families who had once considered themselves financially secure often discovered that political instability could erase fortunes far more quickly than poor investment decisions ever could. Switzerland followed a remarkably different path. Although it was surrounded by conflict and deeply affected by the economic consequences of European wars, its political institutions remained intact. Its cities avoided the widespread destruction experienced elsewhere on the continent. Its legal system continued functioning without interruption, and its economy retained a level of predictability that became increasingly rare in Europe. For investors and wealthy families observing these events, Switzerland represented something that was becoming difficult to find anywhere else: continuity. Property rights remained protected, contracts continued to be enforced, and the rules governing business and finance changed gradually rather than dramatically. These qualities may not have generated dramatic headlines, but they created an environment where long-term planning became possible. This growing reputation for stability gradually attracted merchants, entrepreneurs, and industrial families whose wealth often extended across multiple countries. They understood that creating wealth and preserving wealth required entirely different conditions. Businesses could be built in fast-growing economies, but preserving the profits generated by those businesses required confidence that political instability would not suddenly undermine decades of success. Switzerland's consistency offered precisely that reassurance. It became a place where fortunes could be protected from many of the risks that repeatedly threatened assets elsewhere in Europe, not because the country promised extraordinary investment returns, but because it promised something far more valuable: predictability. By the beginning of the 20th century, Switzerland had already established the foundation upon which its financial reputation would later be built. Its greatest advantage was not banking secrecy, low taxes, or even sophisticated financial institutions, all of which would develop more fully in later decades. Its greatest advantage was that generations of wealthy individuals had come to view Switzerland as one of the few countries where political stability, legal certainty, and economic discipline consistently outlasted the crises affecting the rest of Europe. That reputation was earned slowly over centuries rather than created through legislation, and it became the cornerstone of Switzerland's future success. Before the country became known as the world's banker, it first became known as one of the safest places on earth to preserve wealth, a distinction that would ultimately prove far more enduring than any single banking law or financial innovation. Chapter 2: The Real Product Switzerland Sells. By the late 19th century, Switzerland had already earned a reputation for political stability. But stability alone was not enough to make it the financial capital of the world's wealthiest families. Plenty of countries enjoyed long periods of peace without becoming global centers of private finance. What transformed Switzerland from a stable nation into a financial powerhouse was its ability to build institutions that wealthy individuals could trust across generations. While other governments viewed finance as an extension of politics, Switzerland gradually developed a system in which financial institutions operated with a level of independence, professionalism, and predictability that became increasingly rare elsewhere. Over time, the country stopped selling geography or neutrality. Instead, it began selling confidence. The confidence that wealth placed within its borders would be managed according to clear rules rather than political convenience. One of the earliest foundations of that confidence was Switzerland's private banking tradition. Unlike large commercial banks that primarily served businesses and ordinary consumers, private banks focused on a much smaller clientele composed of wealthy families, entrepreneurs, and aristocrats. Many of these institutions were established as partnerships, meaning the partners themselves carried personal liability for the bank's obligations. Their own fortunes were directly tied to the institution's success, creating powerful incentives to prioritize prudence over aggressive expansion. Reputation became their most valuable asset. A private bank that lost the trust of its clients could not simply rebuild its image through advertising or government support. It survived only if generations of wealthy families continued believing their assets were safer there than anywhere else. As international trade expanded during the Industrial Revolution, Europe's growing class of industrialists and merchants faced an increasingly complex financial world. Wealth was no longer limited to land or precious metals. Successful families now owned factories, railways, shipping companies, foreign investments, and businesses operating across multiple countries. Managing these assets required financial expertise that extended beyond simply storing money in a vault. Clients needed advice on investments, inheritance planning, international transactions, and risk management. Swiss private banks gradually evolved to meet those demands, offering highly personalized services that focused not only on increasing wealth, but also on preserving it through changing economic conditions. The strength of the Swiss financial system was reinforced by another critical advantage: monetary stability. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, many countries experienced repeated cycles of inflation, currency devaluation, and financial crises. Governments facing war or economic hardship often resorted to printing more money, borrowing heavily, or abandoning established monetary standards. These decisions frequently eroded the purchasing power of private wealth, punishing savers while rewarding debtors. Switzerland followed a far more conservative path. The Swiss franc developed a reputation as one of the world's most stable currencies, supported by disciplined monetary policies and a political culture that viewed financial credibility as a national priority rather than a short-term political tool. For wealthy families planning decades into the future, the value of a stable currency could not be overstated. Protecting purchasing power was often just as important as generating investment returns. Equally important was the country's legal framework. Wealth preservation depends on more than successful investments. It depends on confidence that ownership rights will be respected regardless of changing political circumstances. In many parts of the world, shifts in government have resulted in nationalizations, arbitrary taxation, capital controls, or sudden legal reforms that dramatically altered the security of private assets. Switzerland cultivated the opposite reputation. Its judiciary remained independent, contracts were consistently enforced, and property rights were treated as fundamental principles rather than political bargaining chips. This legal consistency reassured international investors that long-term financial planning could proceed without constant fear of unpredictable government intervention. Another defining characteristic of the Swiss system was its political structure. Unlike many countries where dramatic policy changes often accompany elections, Switzerland's model of direct democracy and federalism encouraged gradual decision-making and broad political consensus. Citizens regularly vote on major policy issues through national referendums, while significant authority remains distributed among the country's cantons rather than concentrated in a single central government. Although this process can appear slow, it produces remarkable continuity. Sudden shifts in economic policy are relatively uncommon, allowing businesses and investors to operate in an environment where long-term assumptions are less likely to be overturned by changing political priorities. For families managing fortunes intended to last generations, this level of predictability is extraordinarily valuable. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of Switzerland's success is that it never tried to become the world's most aggressive financial center. It did not promise spectacular returns or encourage excessive speculation. Instead, Swiss institutions cultivated a reputation for caution, discretion, and disciplined wealth management. Their philosophy reflected the priorities of their clients. The world's richest families were rarely searching for opportunities to double their fortunes overnight. More often, they were searching for ways to ensure that fortunes accumulated over decades or centuries would not disappear through unnecessary risk, political instability, or poor succession planning. Swiss private banking evolved around that philosophy, treating wealth preservation as a long-term responsibility rather than a short-term business transaction. By the early 20th century, this reputation had become one of Switzerland's greatest competitive advantages. Wealthy families increasingly viewed the country not simply as a place to deposit money, but as an ecosystem built around protecting capital across generations. Stability, legal certainty, disciplined financial institutions, and a deeply ingrained culture of discretion combined to create a level of trust that few nations could replicate. This was the true product Switzerland had spent centuries developing. The country's greatest export was never secrecy alone, nor was it banking itself. It was the confidence that regardless of what happened elsewhere in the world, the institutions safeguarding a family's fortune would remain as reliable tomorrow as they had been yesterday. Chapter 3. The Business of Protecting Wealth. To understand why Switzerland became the world's preferred destination for billionaire families, you first have to understand how they think about money. Most people focus on building wealth. The ultra-rich focus on making sure it survives. History is filled with fortunes that disappeared within a generation because of poor succession planning, political instability, family disputes, or reckless investments. In wealth management, there is an old saying: the first generation builds the fortune, the second protects it, and the third often loses it. Avoiding that outcome requires far more than smart investing. It requires a system designed for permanence. That is exactly what Switzerland built. Instead of relying only on banks, the country created an entire industry around preserving multi-generational wealth. Private bankers work alongside lawyers, accountants, estate planners, tax advisors, and investment specialists to manage every aspect of a family's financial life. Many of these relationships last for decades, allowing advisors to understand not only a family's assets, but also its businesses, succession plans, and long-term goals. At the center of this system is the family office. Unlike a traditional bank, a family office coordinates investments, inheritance planning, philanthropy, real estate, and international business interests under one roof. For families with assets spread across several countries, this level of coordination reduces risk while simplifying complex financial decisions. Privacy also remains valuable, but not for the reasons many people imagine. Modern Switzerland no longer offers absolute banking secrecy. Instead, it offers professional confidentiality. Billionaire families value discretion because it protects business negotiations, family affairs, and long-term planning from unnecessary public attention. Most importantly, Switzerland encourages a completely different investment philosophy. Rather than chasing short-term profits, its institutions are built around preserving wealth through economic crises, political change, and generational transitions. That focus on continuity has become the country's greatest export. Switzerland is not selling extraordinary returns. It is selling confidence that fortunes will still exist decades from now. Chapter 4. Banking secrecy was never the whole story. For decades, Swiss banking secrecy became one of the most famous financial concepts in the world. Movies portrayed hidden vaults beneath the Alps, while the phrase "Swiss bank account" became almost synonymous with anonymous wealth. The reputation largely came from the Federal Banking Act of 1934, which made it illegal for bankers to reveal client information without authorization. At the time, Europe was becoming increasingly unstable. Many individuals feared political persecution or government confiscation of their assets, making Swiss confidentiality highly attractive. Over time, however, secrecy attracted both legitimate investors and people seeking to hide undeclared wealth. As global financial markets became more interconnected, criticism of Switzerland's banking laws intensified. The biggest turning point arrived after the 2008 financial crisis. Governments facing massive deficits began aggressively targeting offshore tax evasion. Investigations into major Swiss banks, including UBS, forced Switzerland to cooperate with foreign authorities. The country eventually adopted international tax transparency standards and joined the OECD's Automatic Exchange of Information system, ending the era of absolute banking secrecy. Many believed this would destroy Switzerland's financial industry. It didn't. Although some assets left the country, Switzerland remained the world's leading center for cross-border wealth management. The reason soon became clear. Wealthy families had never chosen Switzerland because of secrecy alone. They stayed because of experienced advisors, reliable institutions, legal stability, and a financial culture built around long-term preservation. Ironically, the end of banking secrecy revealed Switzerland's greatest strength. Once confidentiality was no longer its defining feature, the country proved that its success had always rested on something much harder to replicate: trust earned over centuries. Chapter 5. Why Switzerland Still Leads Today. Switzerland faces more competition than ever before. Singapore has become Asia's leading wealth management hub. Dubai and Abu Dhabi are attracting entrepreneurs with favorable tax policies and modern financial infrastructure. Technology is also transforming how fortunes are created and managed, while blockchain and digital assets are reshaping global finance. Yet Switzerland continues to lead. The reason lies in an ecosystem that extends far beyond banking. Luxury watchmakers such as Rolex, Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, Omega, and Vacheron Constantin have become symbols of craftsmanship and permanence. Their philosophy mirrors Swiss wealth management itself: build something that lasts for generations rather than chasing short-term trends. Healthcare is another advantage. Companies like Roche and Novartis, together with world-class hospitals and research institutions, have made Switzerland one of the world's leading medical centers. For wealthy families planning generations ahead, access to exceptional healthcare is another important reason to remain. The country also plays a surprisingly large role in global commodity trading. Despite its limited natural resources, firms based in Geneva and Zug handle enormous volumes of international trade in oil, metals, and agricultural products. This has strengthened Switzerland's position as a global meeting point for finance and international business. Education and diplomacy add even more value. Prestigious boarding schools attract students from influential families around the world, while Geneva hosts organizations such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Together, they reinforce Switzerland's reputation as a neutral place where governments, businesses, and international institutions can cooperate. Perhaps the country's greatest advantage, however, is its political and legal stability. Major policy changes happen gradually, businesses can plan decades ahead, and the Swiss franc remains one of the world's most trusted currencies during periods of global uncertainty. Competitors can build modern financial districts. They can offer attractive tax incentives and advanced technology, but recreating centuries of institutional trust is far more difficult. That is why billionaire families continue to choose Switzerland, not because it promises the highest returns, but because it consistently delivers predictability. Switzerland's story has never been just about secret bank accounts. Its real achievement was creating an environment where wealth could survive generations. Political neutrality, reliable institutions, professional expertise, legal certainty, and a culture of discretion combined to build one of the most trusted financial systems in modern history. Even after banking secrecy faded, those foundations remained intact because they had always been the country's true competitive advantage. The financial world will continue to change. New technologies will emerge, regulations will evolve, and ambitious financial centers will continue competing for global wealth. But the world's richest families are not simply looking for higher returns. They are looking for confidence. Confidence that their businesses will be protected by stable laws. Confidence that experienced professionals will manage their affairs with discretion. And confidence that the fortunes they built today will still exist decades from now. For more than 2 centuries, Switzerland has earned that confidence. And as long as stability remains one of the world's rarest assets, this small alpine nation will continue to play an outsized role in protecting the wealth of the world's richest families. In many ways, Switzerland reminds us that true wealth is not measured by how much money can be made, but by how well it can be protected. Fortunes rise and fall, financial markets boom and crash, and political landscapes constantly shift. Yet through every period of uncertainty, Switzerland has continued to offer something that remains incredibly rare: stability. That is why the world's richest families continue to return to this small alpine nation generation after generation. Not because it guarantees greater riches, but because it provides something even more valuable: a place where wealth, legacy, and trust can endure long after the people who created them are gone.